So the title of this panel is The Future of Connectivity, which I realize is a little broad. But sort of the way I envision it is that networks are planned in advance to use technologies that are still in development for content and applications that we're guessing will be popular and in uncertain policy environments. Uncertain not just because of things happening today, but because no commission or Congress can credibly commit to what a future commission or Congress is going to do. And meanwhile, though, we're preparing for what should happen. So the big themes here are, what are people and businesses going to be doing with connectivity? Are people going to continue to demand faster connections? Or are we going to care about ubiquitous but lower bandwidth connections? Will wireless substitute for wireline? And so on. So we have a really good panel to talk about that. And they're sitting next to me in reverse alphabetical order now, but I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, just very quickly. Donna Epps is Vice President for Public Policy and Strategic Alliances for Verizon, where she manages Verizon's domestic policy and issue developments, as well as Verizon's relationships with strategic third-party organizations. She's also worked in Verizon's Federal Regulatory Affairs Group, and is a federal regulatory lawyer. And she's been an associate at Covington Burling and a law clerk to Judge Audrey B. Collins of the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. Bill Lair is a research associate at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. He works with the Communications Futures Program. He's also been the associate director of the MIT Research Program on Internet and Telecoms Convergence, an associate research scholar and an assistant professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business. And his research focuses on the economics and regulatory policy of Internet infrastructure industries. Jennifer Manner is Senior Vice President for Regulatory Affairs at EchoStar and also Chair of the Satellite Industry Association. She's also been the FCC Deputy Chief of Office and Engineering and Technology and also of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. She's served as Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Skyterra Communications, Senior Counselor to FCC Commissioner Kathleen Abernathy, and Director of International Alliances at WorldCom. David Quinalty, Policy Director for Communications and Technology on the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, which he joined in 2009. On behalf of Ranking Member John Thune, Quinalty leads the committee's efforts on telecommunications, technology, internet, and media issues. He's also served as Deputy Staff Director for Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson, the committee's previous ranking member, assisting in the management of the Republican staff. And prior coming to DC, Quinalty held a number of positions in the entertainment industry. And embarrassingly enough, I see my tablet did not synchronize, and so Peter's bio is not here, but I'm just going to say that Peter pitched, I can't remember your exact title at Intel, but I'm going to have to make it a little more personal. Peter is responsible for a lot of what I know about telecom policy and spectrum policy because he's been working on these issues for so many years.
Great, I'm old too now.
Well, right, only for a few years. He's done so much in such a short amount of time. Also always has had great book recommendations for me that have been good for summer reading and professional reading. And I encourage you that you should all read his official bio because I'm not doing him justice and I feel bad about that, but I'm very happy that he's here. Now, the way I'd like to start is when I was talking with Donna Epps earlier, she said that one of the things she'd like to talk about really is just what Verizon is doing these days because it's doing so many things. And I thought that's actually a good way to start. I don't want this to be a Verizon ad. And we have Jennifer here from EchoStar. She'll make sure that the panel's not. But Verizon has, they did Fios. They started, now they're laying fiber in Boston. They bought AOL. They just bought Yahoo. What does this say? What does Verizon think about the future of connectivity? What is Verizon now?
So I've gotten this question a lot. Probably 5 or 6 people have said, so what are you guys doing? So I thought it'd be a good way to start this. So we've been talking about convergence now in this sector for quite some time. And when you look at our company, we're almost the embodiment of that type of conversion. I think the easiest way to think about it is really a 3-tier strategy. The first, of course, is the one we all know. It's our historical one, and it's networks. So the core of our business continues to be to provide the best networks, world-class networks, bar none, and to continue to provide superior network quality. But in order for us to innovate and grow, we're going to have to change and diversify. So that brings us really to sort of the second tier, which is really what we call digital media services. And so think content, video, digital advertising. So there, obviously leveraging AOL's content brands, Yahoo as well as their ad tech capabilities. So that's the second tier. And the third really is platforms and solutions. Think Internet of Things. So we have a telematics business now, but we also are making a lot of bets in smart cities, IoT solutions, agriculture, healthcare, energy, et cetera. And the idea really is to leverage the investments that we've made in networks by driving usage that really is going to characterize the future, which clearly we're at the beginning of a new cycle in mobile, which is really going to be focused on video and IoT solutions. And our view is that's where the market's going. We have to diversify and change. So it's very exciting right now, going all in on content, including a lot of what Laura talked about. We're making big bets on original programming. So partnering with folks like Hearst Media, new frontier for us, but clearly what millennials are demanding are, as we heard from Laura, shorter forms of content, more stackable snack-sized bites, and frankly, mobile-first content, which is why we're making the bets we are. So that helps.
So, Bill, when you think about the sort of a unique economist in that you think about the economics of it and you work with engineers, and so to demand different aspects of demand and supply, does that sort of dovetail with the way you think about consumer demand going and the types of technologies you see being tested?
I mean, it certainly does, and I mean, obviously Verizon's a key player in this space, and I think the mixing of both the service perspective, which had a heavy emphasis on the entertainment side, but also looking towards all these Internet of Things, but also on the quality of the network infrastructure. If I sort of abstract away and I think about what are they trying to do at places like MIT and in the network research community, they're trying to basically develop and deliver the capabilities of pervasive computing, which is always on, everywhere connected, and that means mostly and increasingly unaware connected, because that's where a lot of the growth is going to be. And the real challenge is the challenge between how do we connect the Internet of Things, the big data stuff, how do we tie together the real world and the virtual world? And that is a huge problem. And relating back to the talk we heard earlier this morning, I think addressing that challenge is going to call for a radical restructuring of policy, which we need to do anyways. And that's something hopefully we'll get to a little bit later in the discussion. But when you sort of ask about what does it mean to do that, one question is 80% of the traffic on the internet today is entertainment media. But this other stuff, all this other stuff is Internet of Things, everything else, when people talk about it, if you read like the National Broadband Plan and you say like smart X, like smart healthcare, smart value chains, all that stuff, we're sort of waiting to see for that to really be realized. And the question is, to what extent, when we provide all of that over the internet, might it bias the effect of the internet? And so I think one of the kinds of interesting questions that's going to come up is, do we need to think about sort of the networks and the infrastructure and the way we provide these as different from the internet? Because, for example, the broadband platforms that we use and connect at our homes are really important. That fiber, that kind of fixed infrastructure is really, really important. But most of that is not the internet today. And the question is that a good or a bad thing? I actually think it might be a good thing, and that's something we can maybe talk about. One of the things I think is going to be really important here is the service providers, because of the complexity of the networks and the desire to integrate all these different sorts of platforms, are going to be incredibly important. And they're clearly going to play a very big role in how these services are actually going to be rolled out and how most people are going to use these things. So for example, things like AOL, Google, all those things are obviously the way most people are going to interact with this most of the time. But of course, if you hang out around someplace like MIT or like me, it would have been an embarrassment if I'd ever had an AOL email address. So you have to preserve at the margin the opportunity to innovate.
Is that why you're still on CompuServe?
Yes, right. You really do have to be able to figure out how you're going to innovate at the edges. And that means the architecture of how the connectivity plays out so that someone who comes up with some new devices or wants to do something that the service providers don't yet want to do has an opportunity to do that. And that's I think, going to be a really interesting challenge because And I think this will also come up with some of the stuff that Verizon's doing, I hope Don will talk about, but with small cells and then the wireless connectivity. You asked the question about, are people going to want faster connections or connections that might be lower speed but more connectivity? I think they absolutely, all this growth stuff, the economic growth stuff, depends on potentially lower connectivity ubiquitously, but you're going to want all the high-speed stuff because that's what's going to drive people wanting this stuff. And if you have a lot of high speed to do the backhaul for all the different kinds of wireless, these things are complements and they go together. And so like when you think, for example, of Internet of Things, a lot of the video is entertainment video. But in the future, a lot of the Internet of Things, the input devices, will be video, and it'll be asymmetric traffic potentially, but in exactly the opposite direction of entertainment video. It's going to be someone using a camera, and they don't actually care about all the information. They care about stripping it out because it's a really cheap way to put an I/O device out there and collect the stuff back. And if I've got the raw fiber and I can go onto that, there are lots of interesting technologies that can take advantage of that. And so what I'd like to do is make sure that we have a very fluid, from a policy perspective and a technical perspective, that we have a very fluid world that as soon as someone tells me this is the architecture, it's all LTE, or it's all Wi-Fi, or it's all network function virtualization, that automatically begs the question of no, it shouldn't be, and there needs to be those other options. And as long as those other ones are viable and they can interconnect, then I think there's a chance that we can get what we actually want.
Are you worried that there's going to be too much emphasis on one technology, either at the company firm level or at a policy level?
I think that the notion that there's a bunch of 800-pound gorillas in this space and they're going to be sponsoring what their vision is what we should expect, and that's actually a good thing, not a bad thing. We just got to make sure that you can't say no, you can't grab all the cards on the table. So I think part of the regulatory challenge is how to manage that in as light-handed a way as possible, and that's a very difficult thing, and it's showing up in the FCC's agenda is a really fun one if you're a regulatory economist. It's part of the full employment program. So I'm thrilled on that count.
So Jennifer, where does satellite fit into this? And also, this idea of having sort of multiple options and technologies. Satellite is often in the regulatory debates sort of the odd technology out, right? We can talk in more detail about the 28 gigahertz stuff in a little while, but sort of more generally.
Yeah, but I'd actually build on what my colleague just said. I think at the end of the day, the word I haven't heard him use, and maybe it's antiquated and I'm old-fashioned, is technology neutrality. And when I look at the FCC's agenda, and actually, I think it's much worse. I spend a lot of time overseas as well, much worse in the United States than it is in Europe or Latin America. There's an extreme bias towards certain technologies, whether that's fiber or whether that's, in this case now, 5G. And unfortunately, because of that, I think that the more rural and remote areas of the United States are actually going to end up losing out and end up with less options available. So I don't think satellite is going to provide service in downtown New York City. No, why would you choose it? But certainly 30 miles outside from Aspen, it's highly unlikely that anyone's going to build a terrestrial infrastructure that supports consumers, and possibly even, I'm still skeptical on whether you really get the smart transportation out that far. So I think that one of the things policymakers have to look at, and I do think our friends across the pond have much more foresight on this, is the fact that there needs to be multiple technologies to meet consumers' needs and businesses' needs and so forth. So it's certainly, and whether that's Wi-Fi unlicensed, whether that's satellite, whether that's fiber, whether that's 5G or whatever the next flavor is, that's all the same. But you shouldn't be cutting out one technology at the expense and favoring.
Well, do you have any sense of why Europe and maybe other places are more open-minded about satellite than here?
Yeah, I thought the most interesting thing, most of you, because I didn't see you for the month, I was at the World Radio Conference, though I know Jeff Carlisle's in the office and I think made a guest appearance. At the WARC, one of the most interesting things was the United States was advocating for the 28 gigahertz band for 5G. And one of the delegates from a fairly sizable developing country raised his hand and said, we don't have 2G in our country. Why should we care about 5G? And I think in Europe, so that's very clear for the developing countries like Brazil that have huge areas of unserved country. it makes sense. But even Europe, I was just in the UK last week, meeting with the Ministry of Trade, and they're dying to get broadband satellites out because they have these unserved areas, and they do not see, in this case, British Telecom, who's their large incumbent, or any of the others coming into those areas, and they think it's critical, and they have goals of reaching 10, 20 megs, which satellite can do for every citizen. So Europe's actually been incredibly supportive of satellite, which is kind of against what I was always, Europe used to always go, oh, well, they have so much better coverage than the US, right? But there are these areas that there is a need for service. And I think if you went out to the US, you'd find, I thought it was fascinating. There's a professor at Stanford who did, at UC Santa Barbara, wrong school, because I was talking to Greg earlier, who did an economic analysis looking at why people choose satellite broadband over other technologies and what their buying patterns are. And it turns out some of the reasons are just shocking. I thought it turns out if you have a manufactured home, you're going to choose satellite broadband because you don't have the infrastructure in your home to support a regular broadband connection. And then we also saw that people in rural and remote areas, even though packages of up to 10, 15 megs were available, were generally only choosing the lower end packages. And it's not clear if that's because of money or it's because they're living in a rural area and don't expect to receive, don't need the same sorts of services that perhaps folks in more urban areas do, because it's certainly a choice. So hopefully that.
Okay. Actually, David, let me skip you for just a second because I want to come, since Jennifer mentioned WRC. I know, Peter, you had thoughts on that. And so,
Right.
tell us. Then I want to come back to what Congress thinks about this.
Okay. Well, first off, Intel's perspective on all of this is we very much care about the server market, and we very much care about the PC and device market. So we want to see as much data going. We want broadband to be as widespread, high quality, and affordable. And I'll be upfront, it's not altruistic. It's highly complementary to our business. And with that in mind, in the spectrum area, and I'll focus on that, maybe we can talk a little bit about the wired side later. We think that there are two very successful models, largely developed in the United States on a bipartisan basis over the last several decades. One is flexible license, which involves concepts like technology neutrality, flexibility, aggregation, subject to antitrust review, and so on. That forces the private user to face the opportunity costs. It allows for a change, which goes back to the very first panel. If there's an area where regulation, I think, has not been sclerotic in the US, it is in spectrum management, because we've seen much more flexibility and dynamism, precisely because it's flexible. But the other model, interestingly enough, is not a legal rights, property rights model. It's the unlicensed model, and where spectrum is available at low opportunity cost, 2.4 gigahertz being microwave ovens, 5 gigahertz being defense radars, you're not going to see wide area use. That has turned out to be a great source of innovation, again, because the regulatory process doesn't stand in the way, doesn't allow incumbents to rent, seek, and stop innovation. Now, with that in mind, and moving to the WRC, I think the US government, again, was moving in the right direction, trying to create a system whereby the 28 gigahertz, for example, would have been subject to those kinds of market forces. The FCC just recently, as you probably know, allocated roughly 11 gigahertz of spectrum to new terrestrial mobile uses, and it largely did it by giving flexibility to incumbents. Now, the satellite folks are in business at the 28 gigahertz and have the ability in a market context to buy exclusion zones or do other things which might make sense, like build earth berms or use technology or whatever, to avoid interfering with new terrestrial use. To me, technology neutrality is not technology diversity that the government builds in. It's technology neutrality is determined in the marketplace by carriers who face the right incentive structure. And so I'm sure we can have a lively discussion between Jennifer and me and maybe Donna as well. But if the government thinks that there is a need to subsidize broadband in rural areas and that it's not being done by the market, then it should create a fund and make that available and put it up for bid. And if satellites can do that more cheaply than terrestrial, that's great. But it shouldn't get in the business of central planning spectrum to determine, oh, we think the best use of this spectrum is satellite because we have this unmet need in rural. Governments don't do that very well. They should stick to their core competency. And again, from our perspective, at the end of the day, that process is going to be very dynamic, reduce the spectrum scarcity, promote innovation, and get lots of data moving across the internet.
But we'll get to you in a second. I know Jennifer needs to respond to that. But the issues that David has to talk about are piling up here. So looking at it from Congress, how does Congress view what it needs to do to sort of make long-term change possible in these markets in terms of whether it has ideas on spectrum or how the FCC should operate? And also, we touched briefly on this international component. Do you guys get involved at all in those issues?
Yeah, on the international front, not typically. Some of my colleagues do go to WRC and other international conferences, but Congress has largely taken more of an oversight and observing kind of role in the international space. On spectrum, to plug my own boss's bill, Chairman Thune has a bipartisan bill called the Mobile Now Act, which is directed at sort of doing a lot of the groundwork to bring about the sort of 5G world. And when I say 5G in the way that my boss uses it, it's not necessarily the 5G standard that will be the cellular exclusive licensed model, but really for him, it's the technologies that are going to be the next generation. That can be mobile, it could be fixed, it could be licensed, unlicensed, exclusive, shared. I think there's a lot of recognition in Congress that while a lot of the telecommunications laws can be quite contentious and partisan, spectrum is an area where people can come together and they can be pro-growth, pro-innovation. And one of the, I think, the reasons why the Mobile Now bill was successful, at least in our committee in terms of getting support, and thus far in the United States Senate, there's not a single senator out of 100 who's raised any objections on the substance. It's being held to unrelated political matters. I think one of the reasons we were able to have such success was rather than focusing on a 50 megahertz or 100 megahertz to free up and then try to divvy it up amongst different stakeholders and trying to figure out, well, it should be licensed, unlicensed, or this or that. We went more is more, and we put something like 13.5 gigahertz worth of spectrum to be either directly allocated, to be opened up, to be studied, to have the work done on that. And much like with the FCC Spectrum Frontiers in PRM or order now, yeah, everyone got something. And that's kind of a nice way to go. I think Peter was talking about the nature of unlicensed as a particularly good paradigm because you get the spectrum at a low cost into the marketplace. When you look at the millimeter wave bands, there's a potential for everyone to get some. And particularly even on the license side, where you're lowering the cost, you're not necessarily going to see the sort of $40 billion barrier to entry you did in the AWS-3 space. And that's one of the nice things about spectrum policy, looking forward into the next generation, the sort of gigabit wireless world, is that we might be able to get some of these bands out there for experimentation, for innovation at lower cost. And since it's so far out, Congress hasn't kind of pivoted to, well, how do we make money on this? Which is historically what people like my boss, people on the Commerce committees focus on the value of the spectrum in terms of societal benefit and innovation. But most members of Congress look at it as a way to generate revenue. But auctions, of course, were always a way to allocate spectrum as opposed to necessarily bring in funds. That was a secondary benefit, which for many members has become a primary benefit. But outside of the spectrum space, I think views are very, very different. And one thing that my boss and I see is that this sort of ubiquitous gigabit wireless world is going to be convergence. it's not really going to be, oh, there's the wireless networks and then there's the wired networks. It's all going to be essentially the same. To Bill's point, having all these different competitive technologies in the last mile, I think that's absolutely critical, whether it's terrestrial or whether it's satellite. You can't bank on one thing. But with the exception of the satellite technologies, you're still going to need a lot of fiber connectivity. There's going to be a lot of fiber in the ground. There's going to be a lot of nodes, whether it's for small cells and wireless of different types, or whether you're connecting directly to homes with fixed technologies, again, wireless or wired. And we're going to need to see a lot of fiber connectivity to bring about this unaware connectivity, pervasive computing. And that's a really exciting space, but I'm not sure people are really looking that 5 to 10 years out, and they're focusing on the problems that we see today, which I think are largely going to be solved by some of the companies up here as they just keep moving forward with the technology in the marketplace now. But the next generation that really brings a lot of value may take a bit of a paradigm shift in thinking for policymakers as well as industry.
Okay, so we move into talking about 5G, including what even that means. Let's go back to the 28 gigahertz spectrum issue, which is where it's not everybody's on the same page. So actually, Jennifer, why don't you start and just explain a bit of the controversy first,
Yeah, no,
and then go into it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I just wanted to go back because I actually think Peter might have misspoke. The satellite, at least EchoStar, has always taken the view that the bands, that there's certain bands that satellite industry can share with terrestrial. We've been sharing, for instance, 28 gigahertz with point to multipoint since my whole career, for over 25 years. I don't know how long I've worked now. But anyway, so just so folks understand, the bands that are being looked at by the FCC and Spectrum Frontiers are not bands for satellites user terminals. They're for these very large gateway antennas. So if you drive by and you see a 12-meter satellite antenna, those are basically where we interconnect into the public switch network or into the internet now. So there aren't many of those. Our current satellite, for instance, we're putting up a satellite that's going to give consumers speeds of upwards of 25 megs, has about 25 of these stations across the entire United States. So you're not seeing a ubiquitous deployment. Even for our next generation satellite that we're designing now, which will be a terabit system and will offer much higher speeds, you're still talking under 100 Earth stations across the country. So the United States is a fairly big geography. There's only, say, a half a dozen or so satellite companies who are deploying these sorts of systems. So you're not seeing you're not seeing millions and millions. So when the FCC started talking about 28 gigahertz, 38 gigahertz, and the millimeter waves, one of the things at least EchoStar thought was this was a great band for us developing a sharing technology. We're not providing service in downtown New York City, but we do need access to urban infrastructure, things like data centers and fiber. This is our network interconnection into the internet, to the public switch network. So we couldn't be out in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere. We need people who are educated, who can man the systems. So the debate had really centered on whether there could be sharing between the two technologies. The FCC ultimately did adopt an approach where there are some protections afforded to satellite gateways. If you ask me personally, did it go far enough? No, and that will be subject to further discussion. But the general philosophy that you could share between 5G, a ubiquitous service, and satellite, which in this case is not a ubiquitous service, I think is something that will be mirrored in other countries. I think it's the right approach if you're trying to get the most efficient use of spectrum. So to me, it's a very good example. It gets much harder in the future if folks are starting to look at bands where you've got widely deployed terrestrial service and widely deployed MSS or fixed satellite service. And some of you may remember back in the 2000s, and our sister company, and we actually hold a license like this in Europe where we hold the combined license for terrestrial and mobile service use because you can't do the sharing when you're providing two ubiquitous services. So I don't know, Scott, if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does, and we'll come back to Don in just one second. But let me ask also, just as a little bit of background, If you could just say something about how the upgrade cycles of satellites work, because it's different from, I mean, we sort of have an idea that companies lay out fiber, even though it's hugely expensive and difficult, and might build cell towers, but launching a satellite is very, that don't happen all the time. And so, how does that work, and when would you be talking about using this 28 gigahertz?
Yeah, so satellites are unique in that we put forward pretty much all of our capital expenses are before we go into service. So unlike a terrestrial wireless infrastructure where you could add towers as you have demand, basically we'll launch a satellite and that's when we have service and we make back the money over the years. A satellite costs anywhere from $250, $300 million to $500 million. That includes the launch, that includes the ground infrastructure. So it's a fairly heavily capital intensive cost. It's also highly risky. You probably read in the paper every so often, a launch fails or there's an anomaly and something doesn't work quite right. So a lot of us have other satellites under construction, spare satellites to put into place. We're actually a fairly big fleet operator. We're the largest US operator, so we actually do have some flexibility in that we do have some satellites that act as spares. But it's very different. So when we make a decision, and this was very important in Spectrum Frontiers, and one of the things that still concerns me, personally at least, is having continued certainty. So we start designing our satellites 3 to 5 years out from launch. At that point, we pretty much know where we need to have our large gateway earth stations, these 9, 12-meter earth stations. And we need to make sure that that's available when we launch the satellite. So the FCC has given us some flexibility on that. Perhaps there could be more, but that's really the thing is, how do you do that while the 5G folks are going to buy the spectrum at auction and are going to build out based on customer demand? And mind you, these are fairly small protection areas required for satellite. We're talking about 200 meters. So you're not talking miles and miles. They're fairly narrowly constrained, at least at 28 gigahertz. At the higher bands, they're a little bit bigger, and that's a different story.
Donna.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, just to acknowledge that, and to give the FCC a shout out for their Spectrum Frontiers order, a huge decision, showed a lot of bold leadership to act decisively and quickly to unleash a lot of high-frequency spectrum. So they really have positioned the U.S. to continue to be the global leader in wireless communication, so I just want to state that. I think with respect to the order, it's a compromise. They had a lot of difficult competing interests to balance. We didn't get everything we wanted on the 28 gigahertz. Satellite didn't get everything they wanted, but on balance, I think it's a fair, reasonable outcome. I think with respect to the 28 gigahertz, one of the things we were concerned about, frankly, was expansion of the gateways. But the FCC decided, no, we're not going to just grandfather them. We're also going to allow expansion, but we're going to do it in a way that minimizes disruption to terrestrial operations. And I think that makes a lot of sense, given that years ago the FCC made it clear that they wanted to add mobile to this band, and they don't want to do anything that's going to curtail future operations. So I think on balance, and the other thing that they did, the second interference issue, which Jennifer didn't mention, is the notion that perhaps the mobile operations will create interference into satellite receivers. There was a lot of back and forth with smart people, engineers putting information on the record regarding that. Ultimately, the FCC found, and we certainly put information on, that they did not think there was going to be a risk of harmful interference from mobile operations into satellite receivers. Having said that, they kept open the door for continual update with data. I think they opened up a separate proceeding about that. So I think that's really reasonable. If there is a change in the data on interference, aggregate interference levels, there's an opportunity to revisit that. So I do think on balance, it's a tough decisions they had to make, but ultimately they allocated some for unlicensed, some for licensed, and some for sharing. And I think it's really put us on a path for providing US consumers first all the benefits that 5G is going to deliver.
And everyone else on the panel agrees that it's fair and reasonable?
Yeah, I would say it's fair and reasonable. And I would also say with Donna that the FCC gets enormous credit here. And I've not always agreed with everything they've done of late, but here, within the space of 2 years, they moved from a notice of inquiry, for those of you who are familiar with the rulemaking process, to a report and order for 11 gigahertz of spectrum. And I focused a lot on global spectrum allocation. I can tell you, when I go talk to regulators in China and Korea and Japan and tell them that not only will the spectrum be allocated, but in many, many instances, it's assigned already because of the flexibility given to the existing licensees. 3 years before the WRC 19 begins, their jaws drop. So we're in the US, we're not going to do a lot of money in public-private partnerships in 5G, but we did the single most important thing, create an environment for investment. Just briefly on sharing, I'm all in favor of sharing, and yes, the compromises were reasonable all in all. But in general, market forces in a marketplace do sharing quite nicely. And I think that's what would have happened even without the compromises. But the compromises were reasonable because the commission designed it in such a way that those new uplink stations are going to go in very rural areas where they're not obstructing very much population.
Yeah, Bill.
You know, popping up a level, if I look at sort of like where the grand scheme of things is going, in the first session we heard that one of the problems in terms of trying to realize the benefits of all this technology is the ability to make the resources more fluid. And spectrum has been one of the key problems because, back in 2000 and even before then, the FCC recognized that we need to move towards a way that we could, accelerate the cycle by which spectrum could be repurposed to new tasks. And all of this is part of that movement. If you look further down the road, ideally, I think where you'd like to ultimately get to is you'd like to be able to, as much as possible, decouple the spectrum from the networks and from the services that ride on that. And there's a lot of services that's already happened with. So most people have no idea what spectrum their voice call is handled in. It's an application that runs on a whole lot of different network infrastructures.
Bill, let me interrupt you for just a second. I want you to keep that thought going, but I want to ask Peter, didn't you sort of just said the opposite when you were earlier on? You said that this sort of flexible license regime has been a bright spot, and I think Bill's saying that it's not flexible enough, right?
I don't think we're disagreeing. We actually were huge supporters of making the 64 to 71 gigahertz, that was the subject of the millimeter wave, that's what I call it, I don't call it the frontier spectrum proceeding, making that unlicensed made sense. Now we'll have 14 gigahertz of spectrum from 57 to 71 that will be unlicensed. Makes sense. Given the propagation characteristics, great. But down at 28, 39 gigahertz, licensed, flexible, I think made a lot of sense for a variety of reasons. So I don't know if Bill disagrees with licensed at 28 and 39, but I don't think we disagree.
No, I don't disagree. What I think the problem is that any regime that basically says, here's a property right to some piece of this raw resource, that then the technology never changes, there's no incentives for anybody to change it, that's effectively a mistake. And I think we've been moving towards a model where that's less the case, increasingly. And so the incentive auctions is one of the big areas where if we can actually do that, we may be able to transition a bunch of spectrum from digital television to more flexible use. And that's something that we've been trying to do for how many decades? But, and so I think, some of the stuff that's happening in the higher is that the FCC is recognizing they want to get out there in front. I think if you look at something like what's happened at 3.5, that's a model to think about what the future ought to look like. And what the future, I think, ought to look like is different business models and technologies are going to have different kinds of needs for spectrum. Certainly, a lot of the growth and most of the growth in what doesn't exist in wireless today and needs to exist in wireless in the future is going to be small cells. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to also have larger cells, because there are a lot of things for which larger cells make sense, and the largest cells are satellites. And just if you thought about like US defense posture, if there were no satellites, then the US would have to launch them by itself, and it would. And if the US launches one set of satellites, then that can't be the only one, because everybody else is not going to just live on US satellites. So we have to have a satellite industry in this country for national security reasons. There's a lot of other things that satellite can do for us as a platform for sensing and a lot of other technology. So just forgetting about this business about is it broadband or not, and all those sorts of tussles, which I think are near term. Long term, we want satellites. They need to be able to coexist. They're going to have some different needs of interference protection so that they can coexist. I think those are solvable with technical solutions if the industry can allow that to work out. I think that, generally speaking, if I look at something like the WCRC and the ITU, it's a necessary evil. But like the last thing I want to do is have technological progress in the U.S. constrained by, the arbitrary developing country that's playing political games. Having said that, we have to work within that process. But that's got more to do with sort of international trade than it has to do with radio technology design. And as much as we can sort of, do what we want to do here, that would be a great thing.
So I got to throw a little bit of shade on Bill there. I think a lot of dynamism occurs on the licensed spectrum precisely because the licensees face the opportunity cost, given technical flexibility, given the ability to aggregate and so on. And if there's any doubt in your mind, here it comes, Tom. Read Tom Hazlett's book, The Political Spectrum, coming out soon in a bookstore or on Amazon near you. The history here shows that all kinds of sharing occurs. All kinds of technical innovation occurs precisely because on the private side, people face opportunity costs. That doesn't mean unlicensed is bad. We love unlicensed.
So did you
I'm not
notice a book
arguing in favor
recommendation?
of unlicensed. Let's be clear. I think the thing is, what you're going to have is you're going to have multiple tiers of users. And if you want, for example, to expand access to government spectrum, if you go at it and say the only option is to take that spectrum away from the government, you're going to be dead in the water. And so you need to figure out how to transition that. I'm absolutely in favor of holding the government's feet to the fire eventually, as soon as we can get there, where they're paying the opportunity cost of the resources they're using. But to do that, you have to be able to build a technical infrastructure which will allow you for those devices that can take advantage of this, and the mobile community and the equipment community are doing this. They've got, your mobile device has lots of radios on it, and they're dealing with multiple architectures, and that is the future. To manage the rights, some people are going to want to have long-term rights and trade it. Other ones are going to have unlicensed, and I think those different models can coexist, and when it makes sense to change it, we need to have a regulatory infrastructure so that we can do that. And so something like a mixture of the database kind of framework that we're talking about, or light licensing. So it's this model that unlicensed is part, 15 and that's it, is a mistake.
Yeah, Jen.
I just want to touch on one thing on the database, because we found this very interesting during Spectrum Frontiers. One of the ways that would have, of course, been easier for satellite to coordinate with 5G is if there was some sort of a database, and the terrestrial industry was very, very much against that. And I think we've seen, I know it's still being developed at 3.5 and the jury's still out, but I do think that to the extent that information is going to have to be available for true sharing to exist, at least until cognitive technologies are at the levels that they need to be to avoid interference. So just a thought on that
Yeah.
was something that.
And actually, that's a good place maybe to back up just a little bit and ask what 5G is. Is it more than hype? Will it ever be? And what sorts of things, what is the there that we're trying to get to? And what's sort of helping that or, keeping it from happening?
So why don't I take that? As a lot of folks know, 5G is the next generation of wireless technology, and Verizon has committed to be the first U.S. carrier to deploy it commercially, and it's a pretty aggressive timeline, but we've taken a lot of steps towards that. So I think we have moved beyond the idea that 5G is just hype. We formed a 5G tech partnership last year. We've been doing commercial testing all of this year. Earlier this summer, we released some of the technical specifications. And the idea basically is that this is going to be wireless technology that's exponentially faster and better than current services, and will also have almost instantaneous response time, so very low latency. And so when you think about that, there are a lot of very interesting use cases that are being bandied about Obviously, because we're still testing, we don't know exactly what will be able to be supported, but certainly there are a lot of use cases that are being discussed that will benefit from exponentially higher speeds, everything from remote robotic surgery to driverless cars, et cetera. So I think the industry, the US wireless industry is really on a path to drive the standards process. Certainly, Verizon is really leveraging the experience that we had in 4G to try to really drive the standards process, to accelerate it, to invite innovators in to start testing and developing new use cases for exponentially higher speeds. One thing I would mention in talking about the Spectrum Frontiers order, it's tremendous what the FCC did, but when we look at what the analysts are predicting in terms of usage, data usage, we're going to need a lot more spectrum. So kudos to Chairman Thune and all the work that he's done. A lot of good work has been done in Congress on this, but it's critically important if we're going to have the capacity to be able to keep up with the demand, we're going to have more commercial spectrum, and so we've called on Congress to move quickly to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, and we absolutely agree on the spectrum front. That said, though, I think Susan Crawford certainly wrote a piece saying that 5G is all hype, and I don't agree with her on much of anything. But the central thesis of her point was you're going to need a lot of fiber connectivity. And I was talking with Jonathan Chaplin at New Street Research last week, and he was pointing out that a nationwide 4G build out something like 40 to 70,000 towers to have nationwide coverage fairly ubiquitously. But in a small cell 5G world, you're talking at 1 or 2 magnitudes of order more, 700,000, maybe 5 million per national overlapping network. And while certainly each cell is going to cost less to deploy, that's going to require a huge amount of investment, both in deploying the nodes, but also bringing fiber or other high-speed capacity connections to that. And it's going to require, at least in Jonathan's view, a massive increase in CapEx. It's already $70 billion a year in the industry. It could easily be 2 or 3 or 5 times that. Maybe not 5 times, but 2 or 3 times that. And that's something I'm not sure folks are necessarily looking forward to. And the commission, going back to one of Jennifer's points, still defines broadband as, oh, it's got to be this fixed fiber-based, most likely. I guess it could be cable, but they really prefer fiber. And they really focus on that. And then they'll have the wireless proceeding where, well, the only real wireless is mobile wireless, and fixed wireless isn't that really important, and satellite is definitely down the line. And for consumers, increasingly, broadband is broadband. It doesn't matter how you get it as long as you're connected. And again, 5G, my boss and I use it as shorthand, but I guess it's really sort of this ubiquitous gigabit wireless world that we're trying to get to. And the real value is the sort of, again, the unaware connectivity that Bill talks about. And when you get to, let's say, 99% of people being covered with wireless gigabit, or not even just wireless, but anytime, anywhere they are, they have that, and that's at like 90% of their daily life. You're going to get some crazy applications that we can't really foresee. And we can't simply say it's just going to be in the urban areas or it's just where people are most of the time. It's going to be almost totally constant for basically everyone. Talking about transportation and smart cities, you're talking about rural applications, precision agriculture. There's a lot of places now that the current 4G network struggles to get to, that if you want to have autonomous vehicles that are actually not just driving themselves but are communicating with each other, you may well need a lot more connectivity than we have right now. This is going to take a huge investment. It's going to take, again, a paradigm shift in, I think, how the commission approaches a lot of these issues, because folks are focusing so much on today's issues of, oh, is the market structure right for the moment? Is the retail price ideal? Is the speed good or bad? You get to this gigabit wireless world, speeds will become almost irrelevant. Again, what will matter will be the, am I online and can I do what I want? That's what will matter. And frankly, the speed capacity, if we invest and the technology goes where it's going, it's going to outpace the content, at least for the average consumer. Enterprise is a little bit different, but even then, a lot of the IoT is still going to be bursty. It's going to be, there'll be a lot of video, but even then, it's not going to have to be 8K video.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up just on that for a second. You used the phrase gigabit wireless world several times. Is that just, what's the obsession with the gigabit? And in fact, given what you just said, where probably it's not the speed that matters.
Right, so two things. So 5G is a specific standard, and I know a lot of folks in the unlicensed world or fixed world, when they hear 5G, they go, whoa, 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 it's more than just the sort of the next cellular exclusive technology. And so trying to find another term for that. Gigabit wireless, since everyone talks about 5G is going to do that, and people talk about Wi-Fi getting there, that's sort of a shorthand that I'm trying to get out into the world. But again, when you get to the kind of speed, if you get to the ubiquitous connectivity at that kind of speed, for the average consumer, look, if they can have a gigabit, that's great. But the average consumer, even in 15 years, probably isn't going to be using a gigabit of connectivity all the time or even at any point. The key thing is that they have more than enough that they could possibly use and that they have it at all the time. Because even today, what's the average speed in the country? What, 25, 40 megabits a second? Most consumers rarely max that out, except for very few, very occasionally, or you have the very heavy users, which again are the sort of the edge use case, which is not where necessarily the sort of really societal reshaping kind of technologies are going to be innovated for.
So I agree with that, and I actually think we're talking about sort of two separate things. So one thing is, how do we make sure this panel is the future of connectivity? How do we make sure everyone has connectivity? And we have placed sort of this misplaced focus on speed in some respects in determining who has broadband. And so I think, in fact, the FCC, has recognized, and certainly we are trying to encourage them as they start with this USF fund and how to serve high-cost areas, and they're developing right now the competitive bidding process, an acknowledgement that, look, we have a finite pool of money here, and while it might be great if everyone could have, fiber to the home, what that's going to mean is you're going to leave people out. And so the goal should be to make sure the broadest number of people have the baseline speed so that they can do the things that we as a society think are valuable for upward mobility, closing the digital divide, all of that. But then I think the second thing is, how do we drive innovation? Right? And so one of the things we've seen in the history of the wireless industry, we've certainly seen it in our own history, is that if you build it, they will come. The more we build, the faster the speeds we deliver, the more ubiquitous the network, the more innovation follows. And I think we need to do both of those things. I agree with Dave that the average consumer is probably not going to need gigabit speeds, but the reality is that we want smart people at MIT and other places thinking up innovative uses of technology. At the same time, we want to make sure that everyone is able, that we don't increase the digital divide as we move forward with that innovation. So how do we make sure everyone has baseline speed? And that's a critical issue as we think about the future of connectivity, and it's one that I think all of us, industry and government, are going to have to tackle. But I do want to mention, and I think Dave also pointed out, the infrastructure focus, because we've been focusing exclusively on fiber spectrum, but it's going to be critically important for not just for 5G, but there's a lot of life left in 4G. To increase capacity, we're going to need to have thousands of these small cells. Each one of them is going to have to be connected with fiber. And so the focus is not just going to be on the FCC. They certainly are doing their part to make it easier to deploy new infrastructure. They just had this agreement with the historic preservation community. But we're going to need state and local officials to really coordinate and cooperate with industry to be able to make it easier to invest billions of dollars of value into their neighborhoods, into their communities. And we're going to have to explain to them what are the benefits of having small cells in your community? What are the benefits to your citizens, to your way of life, to your economy? And hopefully they will desire it. But this is going to be a massive effort, and we're going to have states and cities focusing on what's their 5G plan? How are they going to attract investment to their cities so that they can become innovation hubs, attract talent, et cetera?
I just wanted to bring up, one thing that I saw was interesting, just going back on David's name of 5G and what you call it, is that for the first time in the standard bodies, I'm starting to see other technologies, whether it's satellite or high altitude platforms, are actually being considered for part of the standards. So I actually do think that 5G may end up with a broader connotation. There's a recognition, especially because of the use case for 5G, that you're going to need all these different technologies, whether it's non-geosatellites, geosatellites, high altitude platforms or blimps or whatever you want to call them. So you're starting to see the standard body process change really for the first time. So I do think there's a recognition that this is going to be complementary. and certainly agree on the fiber side as well.
Can I just add one more quick thing on the international front? This sort of the value of having this ubiquitous, on-demand, high-speed internet that's just all around us, that's going to have huge economic and societal gains for the country. But there's also competitiveness issues to think about too. It's not, I don't think it's enough, and this is speaking for myself, I haven't talked to the boss about this. It's not just enough to have that network when we get around to building it. Let's say it takes 15 years. Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of other countries like Korea and Japan and Europe that are going to be building this stuff out very quickly, and they have better demographics and the better geography to do so. And they're always going to be ahead of us in terms of building out how fast and how ubiquitous these technologies are. But if we get too far behind, the companies that will be innovating the services and the technologies that will take advantage of this will be increasingly targeted at overseas markets instead of the U.S. market. And that will only make it more likely that the companies that will kind of dominate the 5G world will be less American than they currently are today. We won the 4G world, and most of the innovation, a lot of the advancements are coming from American companies, relatively speaking. We don't want to lose that competitive advantage, which is why it's so important not just to say, well, if it gets there in 15 years, okay. We should try as a global competitiveness issue for the United States, try to make sure we're getting there as fast as possible, keep as close as we can to those other markets so that people will still want to innovate here because we still have the locus of technology and people and users that are high value. We want to make sure we don't get so far behind that our platform undermines the advantages that we have in the current generation.
Yeah.
Peter.
Yes, I'm going to take my stab at defining 5G. Very simply, 2G voice, 3G some data, 4G lots of data, 5G connected society. It's orthogonal to the old trends. And just a point on the infrastructure, it isn't just an act of faith about building it and they will come. I think it's important to look at the ICT markets and the importance of the bandwagon phenomenon. Again, plug another book, Jeff Rolfe's wonderful book on bandwagon effects in high tech. If you think about the PC and software, CDs, DVDs, color television, on, there's this incredible complementarity between the hardware and the software, and you have to achieve that critical mass. But once you do, then the demand curve is actually backward bending, and we get huge growth. And that is what we're going to see in 5G. And so I think it's, this connected society concept is extremely powerful and is supported by the history of the development of technologies in the high-tech sector generally.
That's 2 book recommendations from Peter. See, I told you.
There you go.
So Donna said we want smart people at MIT thinking about some of this stuff. We have a smart person from MIT, and hopefully he's been thinking about it a little bit.
So I think 5G, as a technical vision, I think, Peter talked about it, different people talk about it in other ways. The one that's sort of the most demanding is the 1 millisecond latency. And that, if you thought about really, first of all, who needs that? Why would I need it? Well, if you're going to do connected cars, or you're going to control someone's insulin pump over the internet, or you're going to control drones in real time over the network, and a bunch of these other things, then you say, I really need that. And that calls for a really, really different network architecture. And it's going to cost a whole lot of capital if you actually said, how would I build that? And you probably won't build 3 of those, just like it's one thing to have 5 or 6 2G competitors. It's a whole nother thing because of the spectrum resources they need, the capital infrastructure they need to have 5 or 6 LTE providers. We're lucky to have as many as we do in the US, and the question is whether or not that's going to be long-term sustainable. So part of the problem there is if all those things I said, like insulin pump, driverless cars, forget about the networking stuff. Who wants to have a bunch of cars that are driven by the computer, or drones randomly flying around that if they lose a network connectivity, what do they do? Where they're dropping packages, and how do I mean, there are so many other things in integrating that in our society from a regulatory point of view that have to be dealt with, and we need to work on those now before we have the 5G infrastructure, so that we can have all those other bits arrive at the door at the same time when the networks get. The networks will get there, and they'll get there ahead of that. They're already well ahead of what we would be willing to allow to happen in a big way in our society today. So there's a huge amount of sort of policy change about how we deal with that. On the network investment thing, a lot of this is going to be small cells, and that investment's going to have to be done, and the control of those investments is going to have to be done by edge users, because they're going to be located in people's homes. The siting, the power, the where they are, the maintenance, that's going to have to be much more like the way we do Wi-Fi and other things that people buy in their home. And they're going to, and it's going to have to be a competitive marketplace where they buy these devices. I hope Verizon sells me a reasonable femto cell. I wish they would sell me one today for LTE, that I can't get that
So,
today.
That's a
not to be
paradigm shift in thinking.
Not to be a
Yeah.
wet blanket, but I feel like we've been hearing about small cells forever, right? It's always like, it's just about to be.
Well, Wi-Fi,
Well, part of-
Wi-Fi APs are small
Wi-Fi,
cells,
true.
Well,
okay?
and we have been using small cells. I mean, we've deployed quite a few of them, right? For the Super Bowl earlier this year, San Francisco's outfit with small cells. Great for the Super Bowl, but also great for San Francisco now, because now they have this infrastructure. They're going to leverage it for smart cities and all of these other things.
So that's a good point. So when you wire, well, the wire is the wrong word, but when you set up a specific place with all these small cells, then do you leave it afterwards so that it could be used, or after the Super Bowl is over, does it all come out?
They're still there. I mean, and I think the other thing to Bill's point about, just the nature of the technology itself, when we deployed those, we did it in a very clean, respectful way. So they're in a very, it's not intrusive. These are obviously much smaller facilities. So in terms of aesthetic characteristics, they're not some of the same issues. And that's one of the reasons why we have to work with cities and localities to streamline their rights of way and permitting processes, because many of them were designed for the large macro cell, and obviously, and there were fewer of them. Now we're talking about thousands of small cells, so we have to think about, is there a way that we can do batch approvals? So there's just a whole sort of rethinking about how to balance the competing priorities there.
We should take questions. And as the microphones come along, I want to point out that picture there up on the screen. My wife took that as we were driving up the New Jersey Turnpike. No Photoshop. So please be appropriately impressed. Jersey Turnpike.
Yeah, Richard Bennett with High Tech Forum and formerly some think tanks in DC. Couple of things here. There had been some discussion about the economics of building these networks, so a few figures that are worth bearing in mind. A macro tower costs $100,000. A fiber to the home connection in a suburban single-family home in the U.S. is about $700. A small cell costs about $1,000. So if you have an area that doesn't already have fiber to the home, it's sort of a no-brainer to put in $1,000 small cells, one per block, to connect the whole neighborhood. And so in that sense, the 5G, which is, I think, largely motivated by the realization that most people who have fiber to the home still access the internet through their Wi-Fi. And so why do you need wire everywhere? You need wire to bring the radio close enough to the user for it to be functional. And it's that realization, I think, that has prompted 5G, which, by the way, goes up to 10 gigs. So isn't this, so I have to put a question on the end of that. So aren't we really looking at a new paradigm for bringing broadband to the home with 5G, as well as the smart cities and healthcare and security and all that stuff?
Absolutely. It wasn't mentioned, so I'm glad you brought it up. One of the ways our CEO describes 5G is really wireless fiber, because it's the idea that you can deliver the type of enhanced broadband experience over a wireless connection that previously you had to deploy fiber to the home. You had to have a physical connection. So literally, the last mile becomes a virtual connection. And so in that respect, it becomes a real alternative for home broadband. And that's really important, obviously, for obvious reasons. So I think that's absolutely the case, and will provide a lot more competition in that home broadband market.
Yeah, and I think the FCC's almost, this is overstating it perhaps, obsession with fiber to the home. I think it misses the point, but it's still, you need to get fiber to the curb, fiber to the neighborhood, fiber to the node, and we're gonna need a lot more of that. So while the FCC's focus on that sort of the last air gap, or maybe there's no air gap because it's a wire, but that last sort of access technology is kind of irrelevant as we look at the next generation of connectivity. We're still going to need a lot of fiber pushed out for most places, with absolute respect for the satellite, which is going to fill in a lot of areas and frankly gets disservice from the commission. It's probably held back your industry probably a generation at this point.
Other questions? All right, I have another question then. We started talking about standards before, and Bill, at least when we've spoken, you've talked about that as a big barrier to advancement. And Donna started talking about beginning to set all these standards. Where do you see this? Do you see this process as moving along the way it should? Are we, are there conflicts that are?
Well, I mean, 3GPP has a vision of what 5G is, and sometimes, and the sort of squabbling between, the Wi-Fi community and the cellular community. I mean, these things can ultimately get worked out. I think they are getting worked out. And a lot of when people hear about 5G and they sort of, what is 5G? It's separating out the hype. So a bunch of the 5G is the evolution of all the 4G stuff that doesn't need any of this 5G. It's not 1 millisecond. Another part of it is 3GPP, actually figuring out that if we're going to do this stuff, that like, especially in, for example, the European community, where they're like, how can we ever restore our economic leap unless we can leverage our legacy, old cities, and all this sort of stuff? We really have to have this if we're going to have a future. And we want to invest in this. And then, of course, the universities are all over that, like, oh, this is, we're going to get funded. So they love that. And then standards guys say, well, they have to standardize stuff. So they are. I think that's, and you can get lost. So those debates, if you start sitting and say, well, how real is that? And how necessary is it? Well, they have to worry about how am I going to do some sort of augmented reality and where the interface is going to be, all this sort of stuff. But most of that's like, that is so far away from the market, and whether or not that's actually what happens, almost assuredly, whatever they think it's going to be something different. So like one of the big geniuses of going to LTE was it's a name they don't have to change. When they did the earlier ones, they had these acronyms that every time someone come with different technology, they have to change. Of course, if you were like phones, oh, now they're doing this. Now it's LTE, and then you have to say, well, which version and which thing? And that was smart because it's going to continue to evolve. So I think that is an important thing. I think one of the key issues, like for example, one of the problems is like coexistence of the way LTE coexists with Wi-Fi. And the problem is that you have fundamentally kinds of devices that want to deal with the network or the resources in a decentralized way. And that gets you a lot of economic activity. It frees you in a lot of ways. It also costs you a lot. Because, for example, if you want to do a generic phone service, having every radio negotiate for every little hop along the way, that's probably not the best way to do it. That's why we don't build telephone networks that way. But it's actually gotten to the point now where the idea of coordinating multiple Wi-Fi points and so that you could actually do this, and LTE potentially acting as isolated points, that those worlds are kind of coming together, and there's opportunity for those technologies to be more integrated. But there are some issues that are going to need to get sorted out. And the standards are a key aspect of this, but I think it's sort of more of a future-oriented thing. I'm not too worried about that.
We like voluntary industry government standards. We don't like government-mandated standards.
Right.
And yes, there are economies of scale that come with those standards that makes it harder to contest, but you can contest them, and people do, and I think that's the saving grace. But there are great benefits from industry standards.
Okay. I think with that, we should wrap it up. Next, we go upstairs outside the courtyard for lunch. We'll hear from Edith, FTC Chairwoman Edith Ramirez. So please join me thanking the panelists.